This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with an incredible new animated short film. It's called The Injustice of Justice. It's illustrated by the world-renowned artist Molly Crabapple and is narrated and written by a man on Ohio's death row, Keith LaMar. Keith LaMar will join us live from death row in a moment. He's long maintained he was wrongfully convicted and is fighting his pending execution. The Injustice of Justice just won the grand prize for the best animated short film at the Golden State Film Festival. Keith LaMar made history by being the first ever death row prisoner to call in to speak at his own film premiere and to engage the audience. This is the full short film in which LaMar describes how he found himself sentenced to death after the 1993 Lucasville prison uprising at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility where he was being held. This is The Injustice of Justice.
My name is Keith LaMar. I'm a poet, author, and musician. For the past 31 years, I've been in solitary confinement, buried under the never-ending agony of sensory deprivation. On January the 13th, 2027, the state of Ohio intends to kill me. I'm innocent. Thousands of people around the country and the world have rallied around my cause, joining me in my demand for justice. Here's my story. When I was 19 years old and selling drugs, a group of would-be robbers in search of money forced their way into my apartment. A shootout ensued, and regrettably I took someone's life and was myself shot twice in the legs. Facing a long prison sentence and on the advice of counsel, I pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to serve 18 years to life. Determined to redeem myself and make good on my potential, I completed my GED, enrolled in college, and became a voracious reader in an attempt to repair myself to society. I was in the 4th year of my sentence when, in 1993, a riot erupted inside the prison. Apparently, a group of Muslim prisoners on religious grounds refused to submit to mandatory tuberculosis testing and were given an ultimatum: take the test or else. Amid rumors of a forced inoculation, the Muslims took over the prison in protest, releasing some 400 prisoners from their cells and setting into motion an 11-day standoff that would ultimately claim the lives of 1 guard and 9 prisoners. I was on the recreation yard when it all began. A guard came running out of the building with blood streaming down his face, followed by a masked prisoner who was carrying a weapon and yelling, "We taking over." Against my better judgment, I went inside to check on my personal belongings. A fatal mistake. It was complete chaos. When I made it to my assigned location, I discovered that it was being used as a holding area for hostages, both guards and prisoners. I was thereafter approached by a masked prisoner who gave me the option to either participate or leave. I chose to leave. Hundreds of us gathered on the yard, waiting as the National Guard and Highway Patrol took up watch outside the perimeter fence. Later, when dead bodies were dumped into the yard, they stood by and did nothing. It was as if I was trapped inside a nightmare. Around 2 a.m. the following morning, we were rounded up and herded into the gymnasium, where we were stripped naked and then violently forced in random groups of 10 into cells meant for 1 person. Stressed and stretched to the limit, a fight broke out over food. Tragically, I stood back and watched as a man named Dennis Weaver was held down by 3 prisoners and choked to death. It was a cowardly thing to do, and I can now see and admit that. But at the time, I was worried about my own life. When I was later questioned by authorities, I claimed to have been asleep. It was my way of telling them that I didn't want to be involved. But it was too late. Because I had gone into the hostage area without wearing a mask, my name would be mentioned among a vast array of potential suspects. even though the state concedes that I was never affiliated with any of the gangs said to have presided over the riot. The fact that I was already serving time for murder would play a big part in their decision to indict me. Ultimately, I was charged with 9 counts of aggravated murder. I couldn't believe it. Mind you, it was never expected that I would actually demand a trial. He copped out once, he'll cop out again, was the prevailing belief. In fact, no sooner than I was indicted, I was offered a deal. Plead guilty and we'll run the time concurrent with the time you're already serving. In other words, I would have gotten off easier had I actually killed someone. But why me? Why was I singled out for this undeserved retribution? It's a good question, one that I've spent the better part of 3 decades trying to explain. Here's what I can tell you. When the riot came to an end, overzealous officials rushed into the prison without first securing the massive crime scene, rendering inadmissible some 22,000 pieces of evidence. So there was absolutely no evidence to link anyone to crimes. This meant the state had to rely solely on the uncorroborated testimony of jailhouse informants, the most unreliable witnesses of all. What to do? Well, the first thing the state did was enlist the help and expertise of the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office. This was not a random selection. Hamilton County has the dubious distinction of convicting and executing more than half of all death row prisoners in the United States. And how have they been so successful? The answer is simple and deadly. Through the impaneling of all-white juries, the use of paid jailhouse informants, and the intentional withholding of exculpatory evidence. I have now in my possession the statement of an actual perpetrator who admitted to murdering someone for whom I was sentenced to death. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. They withheld so much more. It's over 3 decades later now, and I'm still in solitary confinement, being tortured because I refused to plead guilty to something I didn't do. I'm innocent. Look, we kid ourselves when we speak of justice. Until we have a process that holds everyone equally accountable for their actions, this system will remain what it has always been, a punishment system. And as we all know, those who don't have the capital get the punishment.
That's the new award-winning short film, The Injustice of Justice, illustrated by the world-renowned artist Molly Crabapple, narrated and written by Keith LaMar, who's fighting to raise awareness about his case and death row. He faces execution January of 2027. The film, The Injustice of Justice, just won the grand prize for the Best Animated Short Film at the Golden State Film Festival. Keith LaMar has been held in prison for 36 years, 32 years in solitary confinement, 30 years on death row. His self-published memoir is Condemned, the whole story. He's joining us now live from death row at Ohio State Penitentiary. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Keith LaMar.
How are you? It's such an honor and pleasure. I can tell you, not just speaking for myself, but for so many people who are inside. We, have been listening to you for decades, and so it's quite an honor. Quite an honor. Thanks so much.
Can you talk about the making of this film, explaining your case and what you're hoping to accomplish right now? You have made this film. You do live concerts that are performed around the world remarkably, where you're joining from death row. You have book clubs where your own book is read, but where you also lead in discussion of other books as well with high schools and other places. Talk about your message, Keith.
Well, I from the very beginning, just wanted to stand on my innocence. It was never really a matter of me not wanting to speak out, to stand up for myself. It was that was the whole point of me demanding the trial. But the whole system, I soon found out, is centered around obedience, around operating within prescribed parameters and whatnot. And I was advised to remain quiet during my trial and thereafter, and I did. I went along with it. That's what we do. And, other smarter, more learned people would speak on my behalf, would stand up and fight for my life, and I believe that. And I just kept going deeper and deeper into the darkness until I found myself in this really, really desperate place where I was really standing on the brink of my existence. I had to find out the hard way that in order for my life to be mine, that I had to stand up and claim it. So that was really the thing that was the catalyst that pushed me to start speaking up and reaching to utilize my own agency. And all of these things that you just mentioned is a product of that general thrust, that thing that just coming to the conclusion that if I don't stand up right now, then I might lose my life. And so that was the thing that kind of started the movie. I first started, I wrote the book that you mentioned, Condemned, and that was over 200 pages. And not long after that, a dear friend of mine, Lloyd Swain, and produced a documentary, which was 30 minutes. And so we was trying to figure out a way to condense it even more because, of course, people have short attention spans. I understand that people have their own problems, have their own lives to live. And so, it's asking a lot to ask someone to sit down and read a 200-some page book or a 30-minute documentary. But we thought that if we condense the story into a 7-minute short, then possibly that could garner more attention. So that was the whole impetus behind creating the movie. My friend, my campaign manager, Amy Goodell, was at the museum, Brian Stevenson Museum in Alabama, and saw a movie that Molly Crabapple had produced. And she had the idea from that maybe this could be applied to my story, and we can, put forth a similar project. And we contacted Molly and her team, and, was able to raise the funding through this really kind individual named David Rouse. And, next thing, we had a movie on our hands. And so, yeah, I'm really, really grateful for the whole process, for sure.
Keith LaMar, in your book Condemned, about Bobby Sands. If you can explain who he is, his hunger strike, and how it inspired you to go on a hunger strike, which led to your case being known. I mean, you've been written about in the New York Times. You have jazz greats playing with you, supporting your cause.
Yeah, one of my friends who I think you might know, named Stoughton Lynn, was a famous historian, social activist. He, in the beginning, when I was first sentenced to death row, he somehow found his way into my life. And he sent me that book by Bobby Sands, Nothing But an Unfinished Song, written by Dennis O'Hearn, who has since become a very close friend of mine. He sent me that book, and as I was reading it, it felt as if I was being sent a message. I had been pleading with these people. It was going on 18 years, and a civil suit was 8 years, all to no avail. And, I was reading this book, and it was almost a last-ditch effort before I was about to give up. And Bobby Sands and his comrade, Bobby Sands, for those who don't know, was an Irish prisoner who, along with several of his comrades, went on a hunger strike in Ireland. And, some of their demands were very basic, just to be treated as human beings, which, of course, resonated with me. And not long after I finished that book, I reached out to the author, Dennis O'Hearn. I wrote him. We struck up a correspondence. He came to see me. We became really close friends. And I decided to enact a hunger strike myself. I, along with several other prisoners here at the Supermax, went on hunger strike. And after 18 years of not being able to break through court cases and all that, in 12 days of being on a hunger strike, I was sitting in the visiting room with my family. And that was like a seminal moment in my journey. It kind of taught me that if anything is going to change, you have to stand up and speak out, on your own. And, one of my literary heroes, Richard Wright, he wrote in his book, Black Boy, that if you speak out who you are, you will discover that you are not alone.
Keith
and,
LaMar,
being in solitary confinement,
I wanted to bring in your lawyer, Keegan Stefan. In one of Trump's first executive orders, January 20th, was to restore the death penalty, Trump said, which includes the order that the Attorney General ensures all states have necessary drugs. This is Keith's second execution date. January 13th, 2027. If you can explain what happens right now in court, where the case stands in court, and the role of the Ohio governor, Mike DeWine, the position he has taken, since he, not Trump, would decide what happens ultimately to Keith LaMar.
Yes. Hi, Amy, and thanks for elevating Keith's case. Keith, unfortunately, exhausted his direct appeals long ago. The state courts and federal courts looked at his trial and determined incorrectly that there were no constitutional deficiencies and upheld his conviction and his death sentence. I do think that any fair-minded jurist looking at his trial now would deem it unconstitutional and overturn his convictions. Unfortunately, the only way back into court is to find newly discovered evidence. So me and a team of attorneys have been reviewing all the records in his case and talking to witnesses for the last 2 years, trying to turn up newly discovered evidence. We have discovered a lot of new evidence supporting Keith's innocence. I started as a skeptic. I'm a prison abolitionist, definitely an abolitionist of the death penalty. It doesn't matter to me if he's guilty, he shouldn't be put to death. But I can tell you after looking at the record, talking to witnesses, there is no doubt in my mind that he is actually innocent. And we are working to put together a motion based on the new evidence to get back into court so that we can prove his innocence before his execution date. Unfortunately, there is very little justice in the justice system, as Keith has noted. So it's going to take much more than just litigation. We need a mass movements of people, speaking out, acting out, and pushing the governor to pause his execution once again while we litigate.
Let me give the last word to Keith LaMar. Keith, you're scheduled to die January 13th, 2027, second execution date. First was for lack of drugs to inject into you. Your final message as, May 31st, they're expected to have a concert at Joe's Pub here. It's your 56th birthday then.
Yes, that's right. I've been living under the dread of death, as you noted at the outset, for over 3 decades. So it's not dying. I've already made peace with the fact that I'm going to die at some point and someday. All of us are. But the thing that really drives me is I'm here. How can I live? You reference all the things that I've accomplished since being on death row, and all those things come from a desire just to live because I'm alive.
Keith LaMar, thank you for staying with us. You've served 36 years in prison, 32 years in solitary confinement, 30 of those years on death row. What is it like to live on death row?
Well, I think the opposite word is lived on death row. I've lived. Early on when I first came here, I met and was mentored by this older gentleman named Snoop. He the one who turned me on to jazz. He the one who really introduced me to literature, serious books that ultimately changed my self-concept. And but this is a soul-crushing environment. You see a lot of young people coming here without the means and resources to fend off the ills, the ravages of being in this type of place. Because sensory deprivation it robs you of your humanity. And, before long, you see these young guys unraveling. So seeing that and being in proximity to that kind of pain has been really, really devastating. But, I share books. I share my understanding and wisdom I've accumulated with the young people who are around me. So I more or less work for this system, but in a proactive way, trying to, help young people in the ways in which I myself was helped. I am, in possession of my faculties because other people helped me. And so I try to extend that help in return. Yeah. But it's a soul-crushing environment, definitely.
Can you talk about your evolution in prison? You went into prison, when you were 19 years old. You hadn't graduated from high school. Talk about going to school in prison. Talk about what happened to you since.
Well, I dropped out in the 10th grade. I was living a hand-to-mouth existence, basically, when the crack epidemic exploded in Cleveland, Ohio, around 1985, 86. When I was around 16 years old or so, I had been living on my own for about a year or so at that time, and I got deeply immersed in the drug trade. And when I came to prison, after tragic events we already spoken about, I got my GED and enrolled in college, but that wasn't really the pivot. The pivot happened when I started my own education. The first serious book I read was the autobiography of Malcolm X, and that was a pivot. That was a real eye-opening thing. And I was constantly meeting these real brilliant individuals here in prison. They mentored me, became father figures. I joined a boxing team and met the guy who taught me how to play chess. I met this guy who taught me how to write, the difference between a semicolon and the independent clause. I was learning all these things I didn't learn in school. I learned these from other prisoners. That's the misconception that a lot of people have about people in prison, that we're all animals and all these things, but these are just poor people. And, some of these poor people, when they arrive here, they want to try to understand why they are here. And, I began that quest myself. And when I came to death row, all those things kind of, because I had just went through this experience of a trial, which was nothing short of a mockery. All the evidence was withheld. 22,000 pieces of evidence was burned, as I talk about in the movie. All the conflicting statements that challenged the state's characterization of the facts was suppressed. An all-white jury was impaneled, and during the whole trial, the courtroom remained empty. It was only when it was time to sentence me to death that people showed up. So the community wasn't concerned about the evidence. They were just concerned about the day in which they would be able to watch a lynching. And it wasn't until months later, when I was already on death row, that I actually saw those famous lynching pictures that you see in books and whatnot. And I knew it was something that I had just gone through. And so that, along with my reading, I started reading James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Charles Mills, Luke Montcalm, Walter Rodney, C.R. James. I started reading all these people, became like active professors in my education. My maturation and music, my love for music, for jazz grew, simultaneously. With my love of learning and reading and whatnot. And, I gradually found my way back to myself. I achieved myself. Had I taken the deal, I would have died like something of a premature death, because I would have never realized who I am today. And so I don't have regrets about making that hard decision, but it was ignorance that allowed me to do it. I didn't know what I didn't know about the system, and how it functioned. And, thank God for that. Yeah, because I probably would have taken the easy way out and missed the opportunity to find out who I was. Yeah.
I want to bring back Keegan Stephan into this conversation. Your lawyer, he's speaking to us from New York City. You're on death row in Ohio State. Keegan, if you could explain when Keith talks about taking the deal the first time and then the second time saying he wanted to go to trial. Explain how it's not him going into prison where he went right onto death row. It's after the Lucasville uprising.
Yeah, that's right. So Keith's original crime of conviction, as everyone heard, was for basically a self-defense killing when he was selling drugs when he was very young. Someone attempted to rob him. He fought back. They shot at him. He shot back. I think most people would deem that a self-defense killing, but under a legal doctrine called unclean hands, he couldn't apply that. His counsel at the time encouraged him to plead guilty, and he did. And then he was sent to Lucasville at a very unfortunate time, right before this uprising occurred. And then these murders got pinned on him. And then when he was being tried for those murders, he was offered a plea deal, which is a wild plea deal in retrospect, that he would have been given time that would have run concurrently with the sentence he was already serving for his original crime of conviction. He would have effectively done no more time. I mean, I think that's a very, very strong signal that they knew they had a weak case, but they just wanted somebody to take the fall. But Keith, stood on his convictions and his innocence and said he wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to admit to murders he hadn't committed. And that choices made all the difference. He was convicted despite a trial that was unfair on its face, and then turned out to be even more unfair after all of the suppressed evidence came out. As Keith mentioned, after trial, he learned that other people had admitted to some of the murders that he was convicted of committing, but those confessions weren't turned over in a usable form. Many other people said, who did the murders, and didn't name Keith. That incredibly exculpatory evidence was not turned over in a usable form. All of that was found and used on appeals, but his convictions were upheld in some very unjust decisions. Now his only way back into court is through newly discovered evidence, and another motion starting in the state court, which is going to take time to litigate, which is what his legal team, including myself, are working on now.
And of course, the death date is set for January 13th, 2027. Keegan, can you talk about President Trump's executive order? I think it was on the first day, on January 20th, where he tried to make sure the Attorney General gets execution drugs to the states. In fact, that's why Keith LaMar's first execution date was vacated, because Ohio didn't have the drugs to inject in him.
Yes, it's a horrifying executive order. I think it exemplifies that the cruelness is the point of this administration. Many drug companies are sort of uncomfortable providing the drugs that are used to effect executions in this country. And for that reason, Ohio's been unable to execute people since Governor DeWine has taken office. They've said that they won't supply it. And then Governor DeWine has said if he can't, have those drugs for medically necessary purposes, then he doesn't want to, not be able to get them just to use them for executions. President Trump's executive order is encouraging, the DOJ to get involved and kind of like put pressure on these drug companies to provide drugs in ways that they have said that they ethically do not want to, which is another sort of horrifying use of executive power to put pressure on private actors to do things they don't want to do ethically and morally. It's horrifying, and it may in fact enable Ohio to move forward with executions, which could likely make Keith's current execution date a very real execution date, which is a absolutely terrifying prospect. I've spent time with Keith on death row. He is the most incredible human being I've met, living at liberty or incarcerated. He is brilliant and artistic. He's absolutely innocent, and the state plans to kill him.
How do you live with the specter, Keith LaMar, over your head, the specter of death, that there is a date for you to die?
Attached to your existence is daunting. I won't even try to, deny that. But if I focus too much on it, Amy, it will immobilize me. It will stop me or prevent me from doing the things that need to be done. A lot of times when you see guys in my situation, you very seldom hear from them directly. There's always someone else speaking for them, and sometimes that's because there's rules to prevent you from speaking on your behalf. But we filed a lawsuit, and so I'm perfectly within my rights to do what I'm doing, to speak out for my life, and I tend to do that. Thinking about what you just asked Keegan about the executive order, and it's maddening. It's maddening when you think about, here's a person who, rants and raves about the injustice of the system when it relates to him personally. And yet you see the overhaul that's going on where there's no awareness or connection to his own personal experience. I mean, if he is to believe the system is corrupt, and yet the same person is arming this very corrupt system to take other people's lives, human beings' lives. But it's on par or of the piece with everything else that flows from the system and where we are right now, with the direction that we are moving in right now as a country. But me personally, I have all these amazing people who are actually fighting with me, not for me, but with me. And for that, I'm truly grateful. I try not to dwell too much on the execution date, because I don't want to give it validity, where that becomes a self-fulfilling thing in my life. I want to move in the opposite direction and push against that, in every way possible. Yeah.
I wanted to bring Amy Gordeev into this conversation. She's the director of the Justice for Keith LaMar Foundation, speaking to us, I believe, also from Youngstown, but not inside the prison, outside. She's a high school teacher. Amy, can you talk about what the Justice for Keith LaMar Foundation is and the kind of global outreach that Keith has been able to do from prison with the support, as he said it, of people working with him?
Thank you so much for having me on, Amy. Justice for Keith LaMar has evolved. It used to be just a group of friends and supporters here in Ohio, and it was kind of a slogan we had. But in time, as our movement grew, we really realized we needed to develop this into something more organized. And so we are now a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is to bring healing and support to those who are wrongfully convicted. And so as Keith has advocated for himself, it really, for me, I saw a lot of returns after he published his book, Condemned. It just meant that people knew his story and wanted to be, more involved with him, just engaging in their various platforms. And ultimately, the music led us to different continents, all over the world, really. And it's been really a very, very beautiful, meaningful thing to be able to involve more and more people who hear his story. And again, what Keith said is so true, that he is rare in this area because so often someone is talked about and they sit out of reach and out of our earshot. And here's Keith advocating for himself at every step of the way. So he really inspires those who join us, and we're inviting everybody who's listening to do so too. All of this kind of came through a grassroots movement. And so now today you can go on keithlamar.org and you can see his podcast, listen to those, read articles that he has published and that have been written about him. His petition is there. There's a way to make donations. We are hard at work fighting for him, and it's a very, very expensive endeavor. So we welcome that. And again, we are a 501c3. We can provide that support to folks. There is a way to buy merch like I'm wearing. I often wear that. These are great conversation starters. And really our aim there is to help people find a way to connect. I would invite folks to add their name to the email list at the bottom. Occasionally, we will send out a newsletter. Again, you'll hear directly from Keith in that. And also to follow our social media pages, which is all one word, at Justice for Keith LaMar on Instagram and Facebook. And that's where we can kind of have everybody in the queue for when it's time to make direct calls to the governor in Ohio. All of these things, we're working in tandem with Keith's legal team, and the strategy, it has to be timely, but we do need people to be bold and to join us and to share his story and to help us grow that movement. So when the time comes, we're ready and we make a huge impact.
I want to go back to Keith LaMar, live on death row at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, not far from where Amy is right now, who's about to teach in high school in Youngstown. Keith, I'm looking at an article in the New York Times from a few years ago. Jazz freed Keith LaMar's soul. Can it help him get off death row? And it says with concerts and a new album, musicians are trying to draw attention to the case of an inmate convicted in the death of 5 other prisoners who they believe deserves a new trial. And it talks about you're working together with jazz musicians, with some of the greats like Albert Marquez, who's the pianist, composer, New York City school teacher, people like Brian Jackson, Salim Washington, Arturo Farrell, Carolyn Davis, who are involved with these Freedom First concerts, and the concerts that'll lead up to the big event at Joe's Pub on May 31st, your 56th birthday. What's it like to make this music together? You with the poetry. I saw the picture in your room. You've got a keyboard?
Yeah, I have a keyboard. You know, and a beginner's manual on how to play it, which because of all the things you mentioned, I haven't really had too much time to, but it's aspirational more than anything, to be honest. Yeah.
So how do you work together?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, same way how I'm working with you right now. You know, I'm sitting here wedged between the toilet and the door. And it's, you know, it's a real uncomfortable position, but, you know, I have my eyes closed. I have on a pair of earbuds, and, you know, I just leave it all to, you know, the universe, you know, whatever. You know, it's amazing. I mean, it shouldn't be possible. I say that in the lyrics. You know, it shouldn't even be doable, the things that we are doing. You know, Albert Marquez, who you mentioned, had the idea, you know, after exchanging letters with me, that we could probably collaborate, you know, in this particular medium to, you know, elevate my story. And I was a little doubtful at first, but, you know, I gave it a try. And as you said, these are, you know, world-renowned musicians. These are not just, you know, people who are standing on the sidelines. These are working musicians, you know, people in their own right are, you know, are pretty you know, stellar people, and to work with them was intimidating. To be honest, I went in the studio. Albert Marquez sent me some sketches of a song called "Tell Them the Truth." That was the first song that we recorded, and I was on a video visit here in prison, and we went in the studio, and I was there live. And it was incredibly intimidating. But I talked to Arturo Farrell's son, Zach, who was a drummer on the album. He calmed me down and helped me navigate the stress of the situation. And you know, as I repeatedly, you know, done that over and over again around the country and around the world, I've become more accustomed, more welcome into this community of musicians, to the point where I can now consider myself a musician. You know, and it was all those years of just listening to this music in my cell by myself, John Coltrane, Dexter Gordon, Nina Simone, all the greats. You know, I have them here in my collection, and it was that thing that was bleeding into my system that Albert Marquez was able to see and help me harness into this beautiful music that we've been making. Yeah. I mean, it's really unbelievable. I mean, it really is.
Can you talk about your book clubs, students around the country, high school kids meeting with you to talk about books? Explain how it works.
Well, the same way I'm talking to you now, I call in and a group of, you know, young people are gathered in the classroom. You know, when I initially started the book club, it was an attempt to pinpoint or go back and see where things went wrong in my own life. When I was 13, I was sent away to a juvenile facility for 6 months, and you know, I had all the things that is prevalent with young people. Like myself, you know, dysfunctional childhood, abuse, and all those things was present. But I'm thinking about, what can I do? When was the opportunity for me to intervene and change the trajectory of my life? And although I started reading seriously when I was in my 20s, I thought that maybe if I can get some books back to my 13-year-old self, that maybe I can change the trajectory of that young person's life. And so I started off going into juvenile facilities here in Ohio. And that ultimately grew into this thing where I was, you know, going to high schools, because I also realized that I was in high school and I wasn't learning anything. You know, it's this thing that Carl Jung talk about, directed thinking and fantasy thinking. And I was absorbed in the fantasy side of it. I didn't really know how to connect the dots. And reading was the thing that allowed me to kind of cultivate that sense. And so I wanted to give that as a gift to young people to help them navigate the complexity, because life is complicated. And it is even more complicated when you are poor and disadvantaged, marginalized, and all those other things. And reading, particularly autobiographies, is the thing that helped me. And so I wanted to somehow go back and provide this material to young people. And, we've been, Amy and I have been running the literacy project, I think, for over a decade now. And people send in books and donate books, and we just donated a 150-book library to the Youngstown Juvenile Facility here in Ohio. And so that's what we've been doing. That's part of the work. It's not just about, myself and trying to free myself from this trap, because I was actually stuck when I was 13. And, so my hope and goal is to be able to affect change in other young people's lives, Yeah, so that's the whole, the drive behind the literacy project.
Keith LaMar, if you can talk about what it was like to give the graduation address at the ICE High School in New York. That's the Institute for Collaborative Education.
Well, it was a privilege. It was an honor, because obviously, because of where I am, you don't expect to be able to be given those opportunities. David Riker, who I know you know, his daughter Maria was in my book club, and there were several other kids in my book clubs who will be graduating, with whom I had a very, very close relationship with, and I wanted to somehow summarize the exchange that we had, to put it in words, to let them know how much I believed in them, to let them know how much I expected from them, but to also kind of warn them that the world that you are about to enter into is the real world, and all the things that we have examined.
You have 1 minute remaining.
All the different things we examined about what it means to be alive, it was time for them to put that in practice. So that's what I wanted to say in my speech, and it was just a real humbling thing to be able to send them off into the world with that message. And so, yeah, it was one of the highlights of my life. I can honestly say that.
Keith, you heard. You have like 30 seconds to go. That's the message from the prison.
Well, let me use these 30 seconds to thank you, Amy Goodman. When I say that you have been a big part of my life, I mean that literally. You have been a professor, a tour guide. You have been my connection to my humanity, and I love you. I mean that from the bottom of my heart, Amy. I love you so much. Thanks so much for helping me. I love you.
Keith, thank you very much for spending this time with us, live from death row from the Ohio State Prison in Youngstown, Ohio.
Thank you for using GTL.
Whew, that's what he hears a lot when he's on the phone. The Freedom First series, Amy, if you could end by telling us about where he's going to be, it's strange to say appearing, but where Keith LaMar can be heard from death row. Northwestern, Rhodes College, Tufts, the Scripps campus, UCLA, and finally here in New York, how it works.
Sure. Well, as Keith was just explaining, so many of the kids from his high school book clubs at ICE in New York City have graduated and gone on to different colleges around the country, inspired to become advocates and to really organize and change the world in lots of ways, not just for him, for Gaza, for all kinds of human rights issues. And so we will be going to Rhodes College. One of his students, Coral, is organizing a concert there. We'll be there in April. We'll be back to the 5C colleges, Layla and Maria Riker, our former students and great collaborators and support of Keith. They're bringing us to, we'll be doing two concerts, April 17 and 18 at Scripps College. One of those nights will be devoted to poetry because, as we all know, have heard, Keith is quite a poet. We'll be going up to Tufts in April as well. Another student, Elan, is bringing us there. We'll be back at Northwestern University in March. So we're kind of moving all around. So often it is the young people whose lives Keith has touched who are going on and advocating for him. So we're busy. There'll be some concerts happening. The ECPM is bringing us to Paris in October. They are the organization that hosts the World Congress Against the Death Penalty, and they do so much international support for people in very oppressive countries suffering terrible death row situations. So they're going to be bringing us there. I'm probably forgetting something, but there'll be some concerts in Spain where Albert he's Catalan. So quite often we perform there. So, and more to come.
You're talking about the jazz musician Albert Marquez.
Right, exactly. They're band partners, I would say, musical collaborators, and it's been a beautiful journey. He and Keith are always the fixtures in these shows, and then we have rotated about 80 to 90 different musicians around the world into the shows to perform with us. So it's been beautiful. It's really something spectacular.
Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. We've lost Keith to the timed phone of the prison, but first and foremost, to Keith LaMar, joining us from death row at Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown. And I want to thank Amy Gordiev, who is the head of the Justice for Keith LaMar Foundation. And I want to thank Keith's lawyer, Keegan Stefan, joining us from New York City. To see part one of our conversation with Keith LaMar, you can go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.